welcome to our latest DM panel, this time courtesy of D&D Celebration 2021. We hope you've been enjoying our virtual show all weekend long. My name is Brandy Camel. I'm the community lead for Dungeons & Dragons, and I'll be moderating this incredible group of talented DMs in today's discussion. So let's get to know our panelists, shall we? If you can each introduce yourselves and let folks know where maybe they might find you in general. Mike, can we start with you?
Sure. My name is Mike Shea. I write for the website Sly Flourish, and I'm the author of Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, a book to help 5th edition D&D DMs have an easier time prepping their game.
Fantastic. James, how about you?
Hey there, I'm James Hake. Done a very large number of D&D 5e things, including being a co-author on Explorer's Guide to Wildmount, Waterdeep Dragon Heist, and Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus. I'm super happy to be here talking about immersion.
This is going to be a great panel. Carlos, how about you?
Hey, what's up? My name is Carlos. You can find me on all social media under Carlos Grits, and I am a creative director and the content producer at Roll20.
Awesome. On to you, Abria.
Hi, I'm Maria Iyengar. I'm a stream player in GM, and you can catch my work over on Critical Role and Dimension 20's channel and a lot of other places too.
And Jasmine.
Hi, hello. I'm Jasmine, that bronze girl Bular, and despite being a full-time content creator, I'm still really bad at introing myself. I'm that bronze girl on all social media platforms. I do a weekly talk show on twitch.tv, and I am the DM on a number of different projects as well as player, but right now my passion project is Shakar, which runs Tuesday nights on my channel. Hi.
Awesome.
I was bad at it.
That was wonderful. I am so excited, by the way, to be chatting with all of you today. I have been watching everything that you do, in part because that's my job, but in part because you're also the most wonderful people I know in the community. So thank you for being here. Before we get started, I would like to remind everybody watching that we are supporting our friends over at Extra Life this weekend through donations on our website and super adorable event gear that is designed by one of our art directors, Emmy Tanji. All proceeds go to benefiting Extra Life, and you can find all that info as well as the links to donate by heading to dndcelebration.com. Now, let's move on to today's topic, immersion. Dungeons & Dragons is a collaborative storytelling game, and the Dungeon Master plays a big role in creating the environment to facilitate creativity for players. That can mean everything from setting the stage in the first session to detailed descriptions of events during the game that allow players to feel like they're really an active participant in the story. So, to make sure that we're all on the same page, I'd like to start with the most basic question. What does immersion mean to you as a DM? Please feel free to jump in if there's something that's off the top of your head.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. To me, immersion is something that happens when the game mechanics drop away and they stop becoming intrusive, and the story and the game flows naturally without any sort of questions at the table about what can I do? What does the game allow me to do? When you're immersed, you're fully in your character and in the moment of the story, and all of the game mechanics have just become a foundation, an invisible foundation that support the play and the story that you want to have.
I think that's a great definition.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. Dang.
Good job, James.
They tell me that I write words for a living, and every now and then I believe them.
So are there parts of the game in general that you find easier to focus on bringing that sense of immersion out? Like we can kind of rely on maybe the 3 pillars of D&D in this, like whether they're social encounters, combat encounters, exploration. Which of those 3 do you think lend itself the most to drawing people into immersion?
Well, I think oh, sorry. Did I?
No, please go ahead.
I think like sometimes people kind of get confused on like what immersion could be or what it might mean, in the sense that immersion and I think investment are 2 separate things. You can be completely invested in a storyline or in a scene or all of that and not be 100% immersed. You know, a lot of people, they watch these games that we broadcast on the internet and they're like, well, I'm not a professional actor. My friends aren't professional actors. We just eat Doritos and joke around. And the thing is, I've been in a game for like 3 years where we do that 100% as well. But I think what matters is the investment. So I think like all three of those pillars that you were mentioning, Brandy, I think you can be invested in all of them and thereby feel that like attachment, whether it's a social encounter, whether it's a combat encounter, even if you are still well aware of the fact that you're playing D&D and you're still like kind of aware of the fact that you're at the table and that sort of make believe hasn't kicked in, you can still be invested, which is sometimes, in my opinion, more important than immersion, because ultimately this is a collaborative story that we're telling, and immersion should always be right one step below investment. Investment, in my opinion, should always be at the pinnacle of everything.
I love that. If I could piggyback off of that a little bit, yeah, and agree 100%. And I think when we're talking about like the slipping between like an invested table, like once you have that base principle, if you're trying to push towards the like, I want people to like have that Dorito sort of just sitting in their hand and not really like. I love that moment as a DM when you can see like all the pretense falls away. I think it's easiest to achieve if we're talking about like the three pillars in the sort of exploration phase, that moment when you're offering something new to the group. And that I think that as a game runner, that's your opportunity to like paint them into the world. And the immersion comes from trying to build that moment where you're trying to get as close as you can to having everyone imagining the same thing at the same time, so then they can move and flow through it. And I think the moment you have like mechanics to come in the way, especially in like heavy or important or dire social encounters and combat encounters, it's a little harder to maintain that immersion. But like usually up top you have it, and then it becomes kind of a war of attrition to like keep your table in it.
Yeah, I think that it can be, all of them. It's kind of obvious that people would think that the role-playing pillar is where immersion can take place the most, but I actually think that can all be tricky, and you can kind of do it with all of them. And I think part of it is continually also drawing the player into immersion by asking them what their character is doing in the world. So whether they're swinging a sword and rolling an attack roll, or they're rolling a acrobatics check, you can still say, well, how are you doing that, right? If you're going to roll, I want to roll a perception check to check a door. Well, how are you checking the door? What is, here's what the door looks like. What do you want to do with the door? And then we'll figure out the check. And I think it's easy to kind of skip to the mechanics. And I think sometimes both DMs and players will kind of skip to the mechanics, and we have to take a step back and say, before we think about what role you're going to roll, what is the character actually doing? And that, if we're nice about it and it works well, and we're not saying it to punish them, then I think that will draw them into the game a little bit more. They'll have a better idea of what it looks like for what they're doing. And I think you can do that in all three of the pillars.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I have a couple of relevant stories. I think I had a really good experience with immersion in play by post. I play a lot of play by post, mostly because I have a jam-packed schedule. So oftentimes I get to play D&D in very short bursts by posting on the internet. And there was an instance where it was just like a really, really poor perception roll. And that's mechanics. But those are my favorite opportunities to take mechanics and turn them into an opportunity for immersion, not just for me, but for everybody else at the table. And I think that's something that's a key skill, or something that players can do just as much to help out the rest of the table as much as DMs can.
Yeah, I think I like to think of it like a mechanics sandwich, right? That you have fiction, and then you have mechanics, and then you have fiction again, right? So you start, and this is actually the core rule, right? This is the core mechanic of D&D. Describe the situation, do a roll, and then describe the result. And it's easy, but it's easy to forget. And you'll say like, yeah, roll an attack roll. Okay, I rolled a 16. Okay, how much damage? 6. Okay, next. And you're like, wait a minute. Like, let's stop for a second. What did you do? What did it look like when you swung your sword? What are you attacking? And then what happened on the attack? And then what did it look like? And then what was the reaction? So that continual oscillation of fiction and mechanics, and specifically sandwiching your mechanics with fiction, I think is a good way to remind everybody that this is a storytelling. We're sharing a story first, right?
Yeah, it's important to soak in those moments, I think. Are there,
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to jump in and say, like, yeah, I think another big part of that is the sort of like right of first refusal to your players. Like when something big or interesting happens, as a DM, often you're prompted to like describe it for them, but giving your players the opportunity to say, like, okay, you rolled really high on whatever check that was or your attack roll. Why don't you paint for me a word picture of what that looks like and what's happening so we can all see it together, and you see that like shared sort of the onus moving away off of the DM to like everyone at the table is responsible for creating and maintaining like the entire table's immersion.
Awesome. Are there any particular tools that you have in your kit that's aimed for amping up the immersion? And I really do mean it. This could be anything. Is this just like particular turns of phrases you have in your back pocket? Is this, do you use scents? Do you use sounds? Do you use lighting? Like, what are the things that you find most useful for getting players immersed?
So I am a DM most of the time, and I like music a lot, but I think I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about something that you can do without spending a dime on equipment or art or scented candles or special lights or anything like that. It's a simple DMing tool that has helped me really invest in the immersion of my players. And I think that immersion is best with a very tight, small scale, intimate focus. The closer you are to a single character or a single action, a single object, a single something, the more able you are to give the amount of detail and emotion and weight to events that make them seem immersive. Here's a good example from the movie Lord of the Rings: Return of the King, one of my favorite fantasy movies of all time. And it's the big battle at the end of the movie. Spoilers for a 20-year-old movie.
It's a lot older than that.
Well,
I haven't seen it, but that's on me.
Yeah. In the movie, there's a big battle outside of Minas Tirith, the Battle of Pelennor Fields. And there's three parts that I like to think about. One is right before the fight, where you've got a huge army of orcs, and it zooms in on their commander, and then it zooms in on Gandalf behind the soldiers. And that's a very immersive moment because you're really in the trenches with the good guys and the bad guys. You're feeling the sweat on their brow, the fear that's palpable upon their faces. This is a good sort of social, intimate moment where you can really get deep into how everyone is feeling. And then the battle moves on to this immense spectacle, which is very cool and very fun. But it's not very immersive, right? You're seeing Legolas swinging up on top of a giant war elephant, and he's doing flips and stuff, and it's awesome. It's fun. It's cool. It's big, and it's like high-level D&D combat because you're doing all sorts of wild stuff. But the immersion only comes back in, that sort of ability to taste the dust on your tongue, to feel the fear, and to get all the sensations. Once the battle zooms in on a very specific duel, a duel between Éowyn and the Witch King, this very one-on-one, tense, emotive fight. And this really illustrates how the scale of the topic you're describing, whether it's during exploration or in combat or a social scene, how really zeroing in on one character or one moment can make for an incredibly immersive setting. And that's something that's entirely within your hands as the dungeon master to control, where the camera is focused, where the scene is being focused upon.
Yeah, if I can, pile onto that. This is something I was thinking about when I was thinking about this topic over the past few days, and thinking about like if I had one tip on how to help people get more immersed, and it follows right in line with what James is talking, which is sort of thinking first person, right? Putting ourselves behind the character, like thinking through the eyes of our character, and we can do it both as a DM and as a player. Right? If we're a player, I have a friend of mine, and one of the things I noticed he would do as a player is when I'm describing stuff, he sits back and he closes his eyes, right? And I know that he's sitting there imagining what I'm describing as though he was the character that was in there. And as a DM, we can do the same thing. If we're thinking about what we're getting ready to prepare for our next session, what does it look like if we were standing there? Like, what does it look like if we're physically there? And I think, that scene, the scenes that James is describing are exactly that, right? We're there over Gandalf's shoulder, looking at those doors right before the war trolls break in, right? And that is really a, you know, kind of a powerful way to get in there. We're not looking at a top view map. We're not thinking about our miniatures. We're like standing there staring at that big door, you know, wondering what's behind it. So that idea of like thinking first person, both as a player and as a DM, I think is a really valuable, and like James said, a free tool. All of us can do it. It costs nothing at all. And we have an unlimited special effects budget, right?
Absolutely. Carlos, are there any tools in particular that you like leveraging for immersion?
Yeah, so I tend to lean on so for immersion, for me, it's agreed upon reality that we all agree that this is happening. And that's, for me, the definition of like immersion. Like, it doesn't matter how much I'm into it or you're into it. It's like, can we all agree at the same time that the same thing's happening? And for me, I tend to lean on the emotion wheel. So I have aphantasia, so like I actually can't imagine those things. So when I hear like, you know, trolls at the gate, I can kind of think of, I've actually seen Lord of the Rings, so I can remember that, but I actually can't like make it turn up in my head a lot of times. So I use the emotion wheel a lot. I feel like the emotion wheel can get you any type of what's the word, motivation that you actually need to do something in a game. A lot of times players can't think logically because they're playing like a logic game, for instance, like a combat driven game. So a lot of times they feel like they don't have permission to do certain things when they role play. Like, I can't be mad at this person because they didn't do enough something to me for me to actually be upset. But when you're playing that character, you can give them a reason, right? Like, you can go to an emotion wheel and you can pick the different levels of anger. You know, it could be as small as annoyance, or it could be like rage, you know? And a lot of times we like to think of emotions being like, I'm happy or sad or I'm angry, but there's like a million different emotions that you can choose from. And it's really those little nuances, like specificity kills ambiguity every single time. So it's the difference between me saying like, oh yeah, I got like my brand new car got totaled, you know, or me saying my my tercel got totaled, right? Like, it's a different feeling for both of them. But how I react and how the emotions that I have behind it, if they're more specific, you're more likely to feel something about it. And they always don't have to be at a 10. A lot of people feel like things have to be at a 10 all the time. But again, if you check out the emotion wheel, like you can, you know, jump from a 1 to a 10 or a 5 or an 8. So I use that a lot.
Carlos, I think it's really fascinating the thing you said about it doesn't have to be at a 10 all the time. I think it's worth saying on the purpose of immersion, things when you're playing D&D don't have to be immersive all the time. In fact, I think there are a lot of people who, if you played in an incredibly immersive way 100% of the time, would feel overwhelmed or overstimulated or
exhausting.
Just exhausting. There's and you know, D&D is a game that has its sort of tactical war game built right into it. There's a lot of fun to be gleaned from just like in the Lord of the Rings example, a big, expansive 30,000 foot view battle scene where you aren't exactly deep in the emotions and sensations of the character, that the first person view. Sometimes a big, grandiose, spectacular third person view is just the sort of diversion from immersion that you need.
I hear you, but I would like to raise you that that pulling away, I don't think that that's any less immersive than the sort of like first person, like FPS video game. Like, I'm sitting in my character and looking out through my character's eyes. Every movie I've ever watched that like I've watched more than once, at some point I felt immersed in, even though I wasn't looking out through a protagonist's eyes. So I think my suggestion for like things to do that are immersive is to lean a little more into like cinematic ideas. And I'm a huge fan of adding stingers at the end of game sessions and showing the table like what the camera sees that's plot relevant, but their characters can't see. I think that's still immersive, even if it doesn't exist in the like, I'm sitting here playing like drow archer looking out through their eyes, what do I see? But just knowing that like we experience fiction that resonates with us, that we feel immersed in a way that like is still distant and removed. That's a thing all of our brains do, being raised watching TV and film. And I think you can lean into some of those tropes to elicit the same sense of like immersive like buy-in without it just having to be the like, here, look out through your character's eyes. Like the world turns and burns even when your characters are doing something else. Like the world exists beyond them. And I think showing that a little bit helps with immersion and helps with buy-in and investment with players at the table.
There's a oh, sorry, go ahead, Jasmine.
Yeah, I think for me, the best way to like start to cultivate that feeling of immersion is stakes and consistency. I try to create an environment at the table that my players kind of understand what they have like a mutual sort of understanding of like what will happen for roles, and I don't make my players roll for stupid things. I'm a firm believer that like everything that's happening should have some consequence. So even if you don't meet a monster's armor class, that roll should still mean something. Something should still happen. Maybe the arrow gets reflected off of the troll's thick hide and instead hits a stalagmite and you have to dodge to roll it. Or maybe it hits another monster. I think that helps bring everybody in. Otherwise, you just kind of sign out and wait for your turn, which I think is not the greatest way to play Dungeons and Dragons. I like for people to like hold their breath a little bit on every roll. Every roll's resolution should push the plot forward in some way. And I think there should always be an equal and opposite reaction to like whatever the player's actions are, you know, and I think that makes the world feel alive. And I think like also making sense of good rolls in a way that makes sense. Like, so, if an NPC hates your party because your party burned their inn down, and then one time you roll a nat 20 that on a persuasion, I'm not the type of person that's going to be like, this half orc now is like, hey baby, you know, we're best friends. No, he was going to actually whoop your booty cheeks, but this time he's not going to. Instead, he rolls his eyes and says, get out of here before I take my, you know, sandal off and beat you with it. And I think once again that, you know, making sense of a magical world and making it feel real, that all lends to immersion.
Yeah, I think there's something really interesting that Jasmine brought up, and that kind of triggered something in my mind, which is that bad rolls don't have to be failures. Bad rolls could be the world getting the upper hand, right? So if you are going to roll an acrobatics check to do a jump kick to hit a floating mind flayer that's floating in the sky, and you roll poorly, it doesn't mean you stumbled on your acrobatics check. It means the mind flayer grabbed you telekinetically and held you in place before you were able to connect your kick, right? It could be the world, you know, the world has gotten the upper hand on you. And I think that's a fun way to kind of make every roll matter, even if it's a 2, right? That like bad rolls aren't, you failed, next character, right? Like you can use that to escalate constantly. Yeah.
Well, and the higher level you are, the more important that becomes. If I'm a level 10 warlock and there are certain things I expect to be able to do with some degree of proficiency, but bad rolls are going to happen. So I'm not saying you should hand wave them away, but saying like, oh, I'm a level 12 fighter and I tripped over my own shoelaces and couldn't do this thing. That just doesn't feel right. You know, like right. I try to kick in the door. Oh, you break your foot instead. It just doesn't feel nice, especially to your players. It's going to pull them out of the experience. It's going to unimmerse them, if that's a word. But saying instead, like, this dwarven door is actually reinforced on the hinges. It rings when your boot smacks against it and does not budge an inch. It's not that you flubbed your kick. It's that this door is just that good. And I think all those things make you feel like, yes, I am a level 12 warrior. Of course I did a great job kicking that door, instead of, you know, I think that's like kind of a newbie DM mistake, is like you slip on your own shoelaces. It's like, I'm a level 15 rogue. I did not slip on my shoelaces. That would not happen.
Jasmine, this is Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Carlos.
Oh, I'm just saying that's like saying no. It's almost like saying no to the reality, saying no to someone else's reality, or it's not you. It's when we think of like roles as like good and bad or successful, what ends up happening is like that gives the game power to say like, no, this reality is wrong. You are playing this game wrong. So like, and it happens all the time, right? Because like people will argue on the internet about like whether or not this can happen in an imaginary game that took place in your head and your friend's head, that no one else was there, you know? And like once the game has that power to say no to a reality of people it's never met before, it's like I think it's harder to get immersed and like agree with it and have fun with it, you know? It's that type of judgment that like you should really strive not to have that type of judgment at your table, whether it's the game or players, you know?
Yeah. Carlos and Jasmine, the things you're saying about reality and the reality of the characters in the world makes me think that a big part of immersion in your game is actually adherence to the expected tone of the story you're telling, right? D&D is a game that is really well suited to telling stories with a heroic tone. The goal is for the characters to be great heroes, overcoming impossible odds in epic and magical scenarios. But it is also a game with a large potential for comedic failure. And depending on the tone that you want to cultivate in your game, your DMing style will inform the immersion of your players. If you decide to have a natural one be a trip on your shoelace and fail, then you've created a very sort of slapstick, goofy fantasy tone for your game. And if you, in a session 0 or just in your sort of campaign introductory material, we're really pushing that heroic D&D big adventure, dramatic stakes sort of genre and tone, and suddenly there's a bunch of shoelace tripping slapstick, people are going to get confused and unimmersed very quickly.
I think that actually legitimately happened to me at a table once where like the intent was like our session 0 was we're all going to play teenagers. It's going to be like a teen drama kind of situation. Of course, none of that happened. The first game was just nothing but the worst roles that I think any of us had collectively seen. And it was just Scooby-Doo from that point forward. We still call that gang the Scooby Gang and return to them every once in a while because we're just like, how awful can things go this time?
I definitely use it as a comedic tool too, because I think my style definitely either goes from horror to funny. But I love. I have one example of like one of my players was inspecting like a wizard study, and they did an Arcana check, and they're a very high level wizard, and they completely flubbed their Arcana check, and it ended up branching off into this like funny side plot because I'm definitely one of those off the cuff DMs. Like I'll improv something, it becomes a major plot point. But I was like, yeah, you try to make sense of the runes on this book, but there's a smell in this study and it keeps distracting you and you just can't focus. It smells like burning gym socks and morning breath. And she immediately was like, I'm going to try to find that smell. And it became this like really funny thing where it's like no one could concentrate on anything else other than what is this, like, did he leave a sandwich somewhere? What is this wizard cooking in here? Like, did he leave like a toad somewhere that's like rotting behind a bookcase? And that's how I kind of pushed them along to like find a secret passage because but it was great. It was great.
And what was it? Like, what was the rotting smell?
Awesome. Yeah.
It was a sandwich.
Yes.
Sometimes your players put out a great idea and you just take it. And it's like, you know, the wizard heard you coming and went through his back door, but he did leave his sandwich, like, and it's like it was a sandwich that had like pesto and tuna or something on it. I thought the most noxious things because anybody that's taken an egg sandwich to school for lunch knows that those are basically fart sandwiches somewhere afternoon. So I was like, oh yeah, it's like pesto and tuna, and he left it like right next to this very strange, you know, kind of outcropping of the wall, and they pushed on it and it swung open. But
Jasmine,
it's
Oh, sorry. I love that story, and I think the thing that you've done here is like that. It's a fundamentally like a funny idea, but you allowed for your player to do what they would actually do in that situation. Like you prompted them to act from the top of their own intelligence. And I think that's a deeply immersive thing. Like, yeah, if I smelled something insane, I would try to go find it. I understand that I'm like a level 20, like I'm a demigod in this world right now. But if I smell a funky fart sandwich, I'm gonna go find it real quick. And I think that's like it's such a little like turning off of like the tension of like high stakes epic storytelling. But because it's so like human and relatable, I think that's like a deeply immersive act in and of itself, which is very, very cool.
And then the thing you did, Jasmine, is you paid off what you set up. You showed the sandwich, just like Carlos said earlier. You've given them a specific thing. It's a humanizing, very specific detail that is like, oh, this is a real world where even evil wizards eat sandwiches.
They would have to.
Yeah, they've got to eat something.
And then it became a recurring joke because, of course, they took it along with them. And they kept daring each other to take a bite of the sandwich. And of course, the smell of the sandwich became something that would draw other people. They did not know it, but all of their stealth checks, I was like, yeah, there's like the difficulty level, and this is insane because you're carrying around a fart sandwich. Like, it smells so horrible. Every time they would try to creep up on someone, they're like, I rolled like a 14 and we still failed our stealth check. Yes, because you have the sandwich. Until finally someone put that together and it became, like I said, that it makes the world feel like lived in. So your players feel invested, and investment, I think, is like the other side of immersion.
I think we're going to need a stat block for this sandwich after this panel.
All wizards eat funky sandwiches from now on.
New canon.
That's just true. Yeah.
It's official. So combat, I think we touched on this a little bit. Combat, I think, is one of the ones that a lot of, especially newer DMs, struggle to make immersive because it is so rooted in mechanics and that kind of wargaming route and payoff. So what is your absolute favorite tip for immersing players in combat in particular, making that portion of the game really feel alive?
It's a little bit obvious, but the describe your killing blow has worked for me very well. You know, just getting players to think outside their character sheet a little bit and coming up with something, and it's a pretty low investment way of sort of breaking into the fiction for players who might not be used to doing it. So that has worked well for me for many years.
I think
I enjoy asking characters. Oh, sorry. I enjoy asking like the players what they care about during the fight. Like, yes, combat is one thing. And I think after a certain threshold of like, you guys are all level 12 combat experts. Like, you know that when a fight breaks out, your body's going into like muscle memory. But like, what do you care about in this moment? And that can be a fun thing for DMs to be given extra insight on like, how do I distract the party from this fight and like give myself a better fighting chance? Oh, is this one person like obsessed with the book that they've been looking for the whole time? Like, yeah, I'm going to put it on the shelf in this room that you're fighting in. How do I draw you away and like change the balance and cadence of the fight by asking you what you care about and constantly reaching out, like Carla said, on an emotional level to the players instead of just leaving them in that top down, we're going to solve this fight puzzle moment.
I think oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry. I keep interrupting. Zoom calls are tough, y'all.
They are.
I think I use two tools. So I play another war game that I don't know if I'm allowed to mention on the stream, but it's less role play and just war game. Warhammer. So I think like for me, coming from this like, you know, more tactical game that's more tailored to like fighting, when I come into D&D, I feel like your mobs have to be intelligent. If they hate one NPC in particular, then, or if like, let's say one of the PCs has like a grudge against one of the NPCs, or if they've exchanged words before, I 100% think that NPC should go after them. Or if there is like a wizard that's completely decimating, you know, the reinforcements, I do feel like the goblins should swarm them. And I think sometimes we get so enveloped into like, you know, wanting to be fair and not and wanting to spread out that damage, that sometimes we get away from the immersion in the sense that we start to worry about, well, you know, am I ganging up too much on one player? Or but the thing is like, if you've set up this criminal mastermind to be a criminal mastermind, then why would they be, you know, a horrible tactician? They should figure out the best way to decimate your party. And here's the thing: if they do target one player a little bit unfairly, the rest of the party is going to band behind that player and start rooting for them. That will happen. It's a marked phenomenon. It's amazing to see, because when that player wins, if they win, everyone at the table is cheering because everyone's sitting forward and excited to see, you know, this person kind of get their you know, comeuppance or their revenge. And the second thing I think is important is having a reactive environment. Maybe that's the video gamer in me. I like if things around them start to change as the battle is happening. You know, the easiest one being if you're casting fireballs, maybe the entire library starts to catch fire. If you're, you know, outdoors in a desert, maybe the wind kicks up and visibility goes in and out, and you lose line of sight. I like the idea of introducing like the things you're doing having an impact on the environment and the environment having an impact on the party. And those layer actions don't just have to be, you know, reserved for legendary creatures. I think the layers should always have an impact on the battle. And I think that makes people feel like they're still in the world. The battle is not removed from the rest of the game. Battle is a part of the rest of the game.
Yeah, for sure. I think utilizing things like the way that the environment that they were described in through the course of combat, because I think a lot of times, especially if you're the type of player or DM that uses battle mats a lot, you'll forget what the 3D environment looks like while you're DMing. I know this happens to me all the time. I always immediately just yeet the information about how tall ceilings are. It happens that maybe it's because I'm short and I'm just used to ceilings never being a problem. But for me, utilizing those elements to kind of interact in combat and fill in the information for, as an example, if there's somebody in your party who's doing a lot of overhead swings, but they're in this like 8-foot tall corridor, maybe that's why they're missing so much in this hallway, is because there's not enough room for them to do a proper overhead swing. Or utilizing those descriptive elements of the environment and amping them up to make the combat feel more realistic is usually where I get my go-tos.
One of the things that I talked about right at the very beginning of this panel was that immersion is something that allows game mechanics to fall into the background. And I think nowhere is this more true than in combat, because combat is the most game mechanic intensive part of D&D. There was a moment in a game I was DMing last week where the party's artificer, an armorer artificer, had their lightning launcher out and was in melee range with one other target. Earlier in that fight, we had just brought up the rules of how ranged attacks have disadvantage when there is someone threatening you in melee combat. And this was at a point where there were many enemies clustered around the ranged attacker. But over the course of this fight, it had been whittled down until it was just this artificer with their lightning launcher right next to one enemy, the enemy that they were planning on attacking. And they made their attack roll and shot the lightning launcher. It was a critical hit. You know, it was a really big, cool moment. And one of the players just said, like, hey, teacher, sorry to remind you about the homework, but don't forget disadvantage on ranged attacks. And I said, I stopped for a moment and I thought about this, because this was a potentially double-pronged bad moment in combat. One, it would be a fun downer, getting rid of a critical hit, and two would be immersion breaker. Because think about this moment in reality, instead of just in the terms of game mechanics. This is a moment where someone, it may be a ranged attack, but they have their hand right up in the face of an enemy. This is a point-blank shot. This isn't the sort of thing where, oh, they've got their sword in your face and you're trying to sort of jostle around and you have disadvantage. No, this is practically a melee attack anyway. So rather than invoke this rule that in the moment was kind of cumbersome and would have detracted from the fun of the instance, I was just like, no, let this attack ride. Because in the fiction, it makes total sense for this not to be a disadvantaged attack. And let's roll with it. And see what fun comes out of it.
Yeah, I think rule of cool tends to play a lot, like a big part in maintaining immersion, because I think every once in a while, like you said, a mechanic can just offload the moment or just set it off course when it's like, oh, but that would have been so cool. Well, why have it, but would it been so cool, and just have it be cool?
The game mechanics are here to support reality, not replace it.
I totally agree. So I can't count the number of times that I've been asked this, in part because I like doing voiceover stuff for fun in my spare time, but I get asked this all the time. It's like, well, do you do voices when you DM? Are you going to do voices for everybody? Are you changing? No, I'm like, it's something that on the spot I'm really uncomfortable about, but is, one way, it's a tool that some DMs can use for immersion. So if that is not your thing, what's a good alternate tip for a DM that might struggle with that kind of thing to make a role-playing experience a little bit more immersive?
As someone who recently ran a campaign where I was the least vocally adept running a game, EXU was running a game for voice actors, and I was like, okay, cool, I've got like 2 voices. It's bad British and bad Russian. Okay, how do we run a game? When I think I've just copied Laura Bailey poorly the entire time. I think when you, an easy way to kind of like sidestep that is to find like physicality differences in like what a character is. Like when I am in my normal, like the DM is explaining the world and kind of sitting back and relaxed. But the moment you start to physically inhabit the characters, it doesn't matter if it sounds like me. This is a giant, dangerous orc, the leader of a criminal underworld. And yes, they're going to sound like a valley girl because that's what I sound like. But if you start to like take on like the appearance of what they look like, are they sitting behind a desk? Are they hunched over at the shoulders because like their musculature is such that like they kind of roll over in on themselves? Do they sort of speak from the back of their throat? Are their tusks kind of in the way? And even if it sounds like me the entire time, if I begin to physically inhabit the character, I think the buy-in is there. And DMing, I think, has to be a fairly like egoless process of like sort of putting away the like, I look insane right now. But if it's for the sake of your table being really bought in on these characters, because NPCs are wild. No DM ever really knows the one your table is going to be like, that's our NPC forever. They're our pet now and our mascot. Don't make them evil. And you're gonna, but they're going to be really sad about it. And that's really fun for you. So just trying to give the best chance possible of like having them take on it, for me, is usually adding elements of physicality and taking notes about like where they are and giving the NPCs some sort of context so you can land on that and use that to keep sort of passively building the setting around any given scene around your players too.
Yeah, I almost feel like the voice is not as important as like having a point of view, like that character having a point of view, that character emoting. Sometimes people have problems getting into a character, and I find it easiest like just to think of like character archetypes, right? Like I don't have to do a good George Costanza impression, right? Like the difference between George and Kramer. Like if I started acting like one and I didn't change my voice at all, you would know the difference. And that has nothing to do with like the voice at all. Like it has everything to do with like obviously like body physicality, but also like how I emote, how I communicate, and what my point of view and what's important to me. By having those archetypes, a lot of times, like if you're making NPCs or villains or whoever PCs, have an archetype in mind, like put a couple together, and it'll make it easier and you'll get faster at reacting to those things, because everything is a filter. Like everything your character does or anything a character does, they have like a filter over their eyes on how they see the world. And what some people do is like, oh, well, they're a bad guy, so they have a bad guy filter on. It's like, no, you have like a million filters. Like this could be a bad guy and he wants to destroy you, but like also loves puppies, because like you don't have to be one emotion. Like you're a real person. This is a real person And if you're aiming for immersion, like giving those layers and those levels really helps way more than just like a voice. I think it's like a toolkit. So like a voice is great, but like all these other things will get you way further.
I agree with Carlos. I think that's why I liked Handsome Jack so much. The voice was amazing for Borderlands fans, but I think in general, the first time he plays over your radio, he has so much personality. He's just like, "Hey, loser," and you're like, "Oh wow, I hate him, but I love him."
Yep.
And to actually piggyback off of something Carlos said earlier about like how emotion is a part of immersion, especially for people who have difficulty picturing things. I think that like having like your characters, your NPCs emote properly, or like will tell you a lot about who they are. So like if you send a group of adventurers to slay a dragon and they come back, how does this NPC react? Are they shocked? Are they surprised? Are they incredulous? Do they doubt it? Like, no, you didn't actually kill it. You're just trying to pull one over on me, because that tells you who this person is. And there was one NPC that my party was very attached to that I modeled off of one of my Punjabi uncles. And he did send the party off to kill a dragon. And when they got back, he was like, "Oh my God, you survived and you have all your fingers. Oh my God." And he was like so excited. But you could do that without having the voice chops for it, right? Because you'd be like, "Oh my God, you survived and you have all your fingers? Let me count them. Oh my God," you know? And it tells you so much about who this NPC is, even without the voice. Both of them work. So if you're like, "Well, I suck at an Indian accent," for the sake of all of us, please don't do it then.
I was just about to say.
If you're gonna do it, you better rock it. But
Yes.
if you can't nail it like that, just do the bearing. There's so much more to being Punjabi or being wired into a culture than just the accent. And I think
Yes.
like, so if you do not have a strong suit of accents, don't worry about it, because you can still have the affectations. Look at how much I talk with my hands. That's you know, if you're playing an Italian, you know, have them talk with their hands. You don't necessarily have to nail the Italian accent.
You hear that, Chris Pratt? You hear that out there?
Think about
When I
that.
see a
Think about
movie
that,
with
Chris
Chris
Pratt.
Pratt in like 2 years when he's just doing this a lot, I'm going to blame both of you. You did this. You did this.
We'll timestamp that. We'll check back on it in a couple of years. Oh man. So we've touched on this a little bit, in that mechanics often get in the way of immersion, but I think that there are opportunities for mechanics to actually help immersion. Are there any mechanics that you can think of off the top of your head that that fall into that category, that are like, "Oh, you know, this is a very gamey part of the game, but it really helps me immerse people"? Is there anything that comes to mind for that?
Yeah, I've got one. I was listening to the panel earlier today about bringing children into D&D. How do you bring kids into D&D? And they brought up advantage and disadvantage during that panel. And I think that advantage and disadvantage are fantastic tools to work with immersion, because they can so easily tap into the situation and tap into the characters. So you can say, here's this situation that exists. You're, you know, on a sled racing across the frozen tundra of Icewind Dale, but you're a ranger and your favorite terrain is frozen wastelands. So you can make this check, but you can make it with advantage. And it immediately taps into their character. The player recognizes that you recognize that they have this talent. And now I'm using my hands a lot all of a sudden. So
You're so Italian.
I know. I'm going to sit here playing with my bottle cap. So being able to use advantage and disadvantage really are this fantastic mechanic, really easy to hang on to, has a big, powerful effect on the game. You can drop it in lots of different places. And I think it really, it's a fast way to bring the characters into the situation and to kind of hook onto those things that characters happen to be good at, and give them a clear mechanic benefit for their choices.
Jumping off of that, there was a moment earlier in this panel where we talked about integrating results and narrative from mechanics into the story, right? There was the tight corridor, and the barbarian was swinging the gigantic axe, and that was the reason why I missed, right? The tight corridor became a reason after the mechanics did their thing. Well, advantage and disadvantage are more than just when the game tells you to do advantage and disadvantage. The game master, or the dungeon master, is empowered to use advantage and disadvantage whenever they want to reflect the changing circumstances of the game. I think a great way to use a mechanic to become more immersive is once you tell that barbarian, hey, the reason why you missed is because you weren't used to fighting in these cramped dwarven tunnels, and so your great axe swings keep hitting the roof. And the barbarian is like, okay, I'm going to switch to using the point on the butt of my great axe to start thrusting at enemies down this hallway instead. And then I think that's an awesome opportunity for the GM to say, okay, you've clearly adapted to this strange situation for you. Now you can get advantage on the next couple of attack rolls you're making with this weird sort of spear point great axe you're using, as the foes you're fighting suddenly have to grapple with this new tactic that you're using.
I love that.
Yeah.
I am obsessed with the chase mechanic, like that's written into D&D. I love the idea of having a mechanic that teaches you straight off the bat, like you are in a dire situation, you're running, and we're going to attack you in the action economy. And that's a way for the mechanics to put on pressure of like, you're running, you have a single objective, which is catch this person. And that means that like, you don't have the full complement of your skill set available to you because you're so obsessed with this like singular goal. And I love the idea of having mechanics that like take away, it's not really taking away agency, but taking away the full assortment of your skills and abilities as a player in order to sort of focus you and narrow you and immerse you in the idea that like this is a frenetic moment and you don't have like the opportunity to like play with the full scope of your skill set. You are sprinting and then you can do one thing. So what do you care about in this moment? What can you pull off in this 6-second burst? So that's my favorite mechanic for sort of like throwing the players into an immersive idea and constantly reaffirming by virtue of stripping away their ability set to being like locked into like a specific kind of moment and cadence for an encounter.
Awesome.
I like spell slots. I like I don't know, they remind me of like Lord of the Rings a lot, you know, since we were talking about that, but like the idea of like,
I've got to watch Lord of the Rings. Dang it.
You know, I just did a rewatch. I tweeted about it.
What is this? Is this a movie?
Right?
What is this?
I just got off. I do it at least once a year, watching all the extended editions. But,
Wow.
you know, I love the concept of like showing fatigue, and I think 5th edition gives you really good rule sets to do that. And so, you know, in the first battle you come across, you know, maybe your warlock does outshine some of the other classes. But as I fondly say about Aya, my level 11 warlock, she's a 2-pump chump. So once that's done, once she like does the cool thing, she's just kind of like, well, I'm exhausted now. I have become taxed, and now I can only Eldritch Blast until we partake in a short rest. And I kind of like showing exhaustion and fatigue through spell slots and other things like that become easily expendable. It's such a small thing, but I think like I guess this is less of a DM tip and more of a player tip. I love playing like a wizard or a character that's blown through half of their spell slots because there's some interesting things to do there. You're summoning the last vestiges of your power and using them, sometimes in great desperation, trying to make very difficult decisions on how you want to help your party and how you want to, you know, help them succeed. And that's a very strong immersion point now because you're remembering that this is not an infinite well of power. You're immortal capable of dying, and you have stamina, you have endurance, you know? And I like even mechanics like relentless endurance for that point, you know, things where you're just like, there's nothing really keeping you standing up other than just sheer hatred and vitriol. And I kind of like that. I like that determination, and I like playing out those mechanics.
That's awesome. I don't think I'd ever thought of using my spell slots as kind of an indicator of how exhausted I was. I really love that idea, and I'm totally going to steal it. I know that we're starting to wind up on time, but one of my favorite questions that I had prepared for this, I really want to ask of this group, is what is the single most elaborate thing that you have ever done for the sake of immersion? Because I know that you've all pulled out ridiculous things at a table at one point in time or another, because I know I have. So
think I'll start. So back in the 4th edition days, I ran a 1st to 30th level campaign, and the 30th level, I think it may have been like 28th level, I created an entire layer of the abyss, the lowest layer of the abyss, by putting 2 different colors of fake spider webs across my entire dining room table, and a whole bunch of like Dwarven Forge islands that the characters would hop to and have to face each of their challenges, and a huge primordial that I hand painted, this multiverse ending primordial that they had to face at the end of the thing. And I think they ended up flying over the whole thing. But it looked really cool, and I took some nice pictures of it.
Dope.
Oh.
Mine, I feel like I'm like embarrassed to talk. Like it's insane. It's fine. I love candles and scented candles for establishing a little bit of extra immersion at the table. I do it less for streamed games, obviously, because it's
no
just for me,
fire
I
on
guess.
set, Abria.
Exactly. Yeah. Every studio, they're like, could you not? What is
Keep your
wrong with
Yankee
you?"
candle at home.
Yeah. But that was the thing. I had a cantrip candle. Shout out to cantrip. That was like a generic dungeon smell for like, and I always leave the candles behind the GM screen so they don't know what they're smelling. I spent a campaign associating the arrival of a villain with like a really sweet perfumed smell because they were like a fae, a very angry like fae patron that was showing up. So I would always light the candle when they had to encounter it. So my favorite thing in the final battle was having this like dark dungeony smell, and then like halfway through the encounter with a completely different enemy, I lit the like warlock candle. It was like a ridiculous, it was a Yankee candle. It was like pink sands, just a disgustingly fruity Yankee candle, and lit it and waited until the table smelled it and realized who was coming. And I thought that was like the weirdest moment. And I was so happy that it actually worked, because at some point halfway through, they're like, oh no, oh, she's coming. And like, it was just such a cute moment.
The wizard
that, like,
with the
existed.
sandwich.
That's
Yeah,
so cool.
it was the sandwich wizard just showed up, all pesto and tuna and ready to party. And
Next time I need to make a stinky sandwich.
Right. Sticky sandwich candle.
Just boil some eggs and wait for the party to
Right?
get into it.
Yeah.
I think the most elaborate thing I ever did, it wasn't that elaborate though, was I did a horror game, and I love House on Haunted Hill and like that type of vibe and Agatha Christie type of stuff. So of course it was, they were invited to a dinner party, and they were all there for different reasons, and they were going to read this man's will and all that stuff. But at one point their characters found something under their chairs. And the players looked at me. I was like, yeah, you find something under your chair. And they were like, what do I find? I was like, well, what do you find? And their faces as they like reached under their chair, and there was something from each character's past in an envelope under the chair, like a dirty secret or something horrible, like a character hook. And all of them were like, oh my God, and like trying to hide it from each other, just like as their characters were trying to hide it from each other. And like some of it was like, I know you killed your sister back in '96, and it was just like, and one of them awesome. I made like a serial killer by like cutting out different letters from newspapers and magazines and just taping them together. So yeah, serial killer letters. That's how I make immersion.
It's perfect.
It's so good.
Oh,
I used to have a podcast, and I got really into it. And I would do everything from like, I would multi-track edit everyone and everything that they did and try to make it sound like a real audio drama. And I would go back and put sound effects and music and all that's like write the music. And one time the GM I wasn't the GM at the time. I was a player, but I always felt like I was a part GM just because I did the post on it, and I know they would listen to it. And they went into this town that was like basically like a music town, right? Like everything was kind of like a musical, and everyone was super happy. And I like spent hours writing this music and like doing different vocal takes, and it just sounded like super sunny and happy. And yeah, it didn't pay off at all. Like they didn't really care. I spent like probably like 40 hours on an episode, and it was just they were just like, oh yeah, that's neat. I was like, okay, well, I guess that's where we are now. I'm just like, I just looked up a million YouTube things on how to do this one sound, but okay, that's cool. Okay, whatever. Back to the game.
I'm so sad for you, Carlos.
That's okay.
I want to find that episode now and just like appreciate you. I just want to like listen and value the time that you put into it.
I'll send it to you.
Please.
I'll send it to you.
I was gonna say, drop the SoundCloud link, King.
Yeah.
And my immersion thing is music too. I'm a music man at heart, and so that's the thing that I really like to share with my players is music. And it's been infuriating being over, playing over Discord for the past 2 years of this pandemic because it's so hard to do all of the music fun that I like to do with the campaign. It's kind of similar to the aromatherapy villain introduction that Abria was just talking about, because one thing that I really, really like to do for my campaigns is give themes, give leitmotifs to every single important thing, characters, locations, even sort of themes, like story themes. And as they weave in and out of the game, I'll search through, a million different versions of Gustav Holst's Jupiter on YouTube. And like, okay, this version of the Jupiter theme is perfect for the appearance of the grand capital of the kingdom. And then this sort of much more mellow version is great for when the young, gentle prince of the kingdom appears. And so it becomes kind of a musical tapestry of themes and motifs that weaves through the game live in real time as I mix it at the table.
That's awesome. I love that so much. You all have been wonderful guests. We are unfortunately out of time, which is a shame because I could totally just sit here all afternoon talking to y'all. This has been absolutely a delight. So thank you all so much for joining us today. If there's any parting words or tips that you want to hand out, save it for next time because we're out of time.
Amazing.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Please do stay tuned. We have one more game left for today, which is absolutely going to be incredible because it is the Circus of Sound, a D&D musical with Kelly Lynn D'Angelo and this amazing cast of people who are going to serenade you through D&D. So you don't want to miss that. Stay tuned, and thank you all for joining us. Till next time.